Another video in my series on why Jewish apologetics are so bad. This is Rabbi Daniel Rowe talking about the dark Bible story nobody can explain until now. Before we get started, if you enjoy any of my videos, please like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and also comment. I always try to reply. Thanks.
Does the Bible command genocide? Jordan Peterson was the latest person to be confronted with this accusation that the Bible has a war against Amalek that is just an unprovoked genocide.
It's God saying, go and do this atrocity. He commands the Israelites to genocide their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. That's not a just war at all.
And so often we see this online, the confidence with which somebody will attack a biblical idea or a Talmudic idea or a Jewish idea or whatever it is often wildly out of proportion to what the text itself says. That's putting it quite nicely.
That's often true. I often find as well that what rabbis claim a text says is wildly out of proportion to what's actually recorded there. So let's see what we've got here.
Welcome back to another episode of Rabbi Rowe Reacts. Well, if you do like this content, please do click the like button. That's good for the algorithm and good to know that you like it. Also, the subscribe button is a good one as well, especially the notification one, so you get notified as content comes through. And also remember to comment if there's things you like, dislike, want to agree with, disagree with, or just ideas about future videos. Jordan Peterson recently took on 20 atheists in what has now become this channel called Jubilee, where they put people in a room with 20 people who strongly disagree with them, and there's a whole format and setup, and it's lots of people are taking on the challenge. And Jordan Peterson is one of them. The video was actually put together a few months ago. And he seemingly felt uncomfortable when the issue of Amalek came up. So by popular demand, a few of you showed me that video, knowing that I've done videos responding to the question of the ethics around the Amalek, or the unease we feel around the destruction of Amalek in the Bible and how we're meant to relate to it. So I'm going to be looking at this video and together with you and reacting to it. So before we dive in, I should say Jordan Peterson is very well known to many people, a psychologist who became very famous being willing to stand up for controversial views, especially conservative controversial positions, which has taken a toll on him. Recently, his daughter Michaela posted on X, unfortunately, there have been side effects to medication he'd taken, and he was having a really difficult time with mental health. So we wish him well. Mental health challenges of strong magnitudes can be really, really, really hellish, horrific for the person, horrific for their family members. And so we pray that he has a recovery together with all those who need a recovery, and that the family has strength to go through all this. So let's take a look at the clip. It takes place about an hour in. And the format is that whoever's this person in the hot seat, so to speak, makes a claim. And then people run to try and challenge them on the claim. And if the audience doesn't like what they're doing, they can raise red flags. And if enough people raise red flags, they get booted out and somebody else steps into their shoes. Let's take a look at the claim Jordan Peterson makes first.
Final claim is that atheists accept Christian morality, but deny the religion's foundational stories.
So the idea here is that biblical morality, let's say Christian morality, he wants to say change the world. It's seeped into society. And even as atheists kind of removed God and therefore removed the basis for this morality and removed belief in the Bible, they nevertheless won't form an alternative to it and will live with Christian morality. That's the theory, plausible, you know, and we're going to see how the student immediately jumps in and attacks him. I shouldn't say student. I don't know if he's a student. Okay, this atheist jumps in and tackles him. So they're racing now.
Hi there.
It's very nice to meet you.
What's your name?
I'm Ian.
Hi, Ian.
Yes. So God says that you can own people as property. He says that you can beat them with a rod too. He commands genocide in Deuteronomy, in Numbers, and in Samuel. I mean, they have a goddamn baby barbecue in Numbers. Like, is all of this in line with Christian ethics?
No.
So then God doesn't fit within Christian ethics.
Well, the biblical library is a continuing story, and everything written in it has to be contextualized by the entire text. There's 65,000 hyperlinks in the biblical text. And you can take pieces of it out of context and criticize them, and that's what you're doing. But that's a mistake I think it's an analytic mistake because you're putting the cart before the horse.
I really don't think so. I think
Yeah,
that
no,
if we say that something is Christian ethics, then I think that all of the books essential to Christianity would fit with it, especially if it's like the main character. When we're talking
How
about
do you deal with
God,
the morality of war?
So-
how do you think you should deal with the
Sure,
morality
sure,
of
sure,
war?
sure. Because I feel like the morality, like I feel like Christian ethics, like this is kind of, I guess I just think it's like kind of an absurdity to say that God doesn't fit within Christian ethics. But sure, well, we can go on my ethics. That's totally fine.
I don't know what you mean by an absurdity. What game are you playing with
Well,
that
I just think
question?
that it's an absurdity to say that the Christian God doesn't fit within Christian ethics. That like the Christian
I
God
didn't
isn't
say
like
that.
Christian
I
ethical.
said that the specific statements that you made don't take the context of the stories into account, and so that your analytical approach is faulty.
Sure.
Don't put words in my
Okay,
mouth.
Sure, then let's go through
Thank
the
you.
example. Yeah, so, and I apologize. So let's go through the example. So in 1 Samuel 15:3, God says, go and slaughter the Amalekites, slaughter the men, the women, the
Yeah.
children, the infants. What's the justification for that? Is that in line
That's a
with
good
Christian
question.
ethics?
That's a good question.
Okay, so he raised a lot of issues, and maybe in other videos I can respond to several of them, or all of them even, in his opening sentence. But he's now lasered in when Jordan Peterson has said, okay, so let's really focus in, and you're putting words in my mouth. I've said there should be context to the stories. So he's now lasering in on this chapter of Samuel, where God is telling via the prophet Samuel, the king Saul, to wipe out all of Amalek. And Jordan Peterson now says, that's a good question. So let's see how he responds, and let's follow the dialogue for a little bit longer.
I don't really know what to do with the terrible, blood-soaked, saturated history of the human past. I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows. I mean, what you try to do in your own life, as far as I can tell, is to conduct yourself in a manner that makes such things much more unlikely.
I totally agree.
We're all saddled with the problem of the catastrophes that got us here, aren't we?
Yeah, but this one was commanded by God. That's the problem.
Yeah,
That's
well-
what differentiates it from anything else, is that this one, it's God
Do you
saying,
think that
go
there's
and
ever
do this
such a thing?
atrocity.
Do you think that there's ever such a thing as a righteous war?
I'm skeptical. I'm not sure. It would probably be situational.
Well, right, fair
Yeah,
enough.
but
I
this
mean,
one
people,
certainly wasn't a just war. The context for the Amalekite slaughter is that 400 years earlier, they fought one battle, which they lost, and God says, that's it, I'm going to wipe them off the face of the goddamn earth. And then 400 years later, he commands the Israelites to genocide their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. That's not a just war at all. And also, a genocide is not a war.
well, a genocide can be a war, but
Absolutely not.
Look.
The genociding of the Amalekites, the men, the women, and the infants, that's not a war. The infants aren't combatants.
look, I already said that it's very difficult to look at the blood-soaked past and to know exactly what to do about it. The answer I gave to the gentleman who is sitting here before you is that it's necessary to read a text like the Bible at all of its levels of analysis simultaneously. And there's a directional morality that emerges across time that has its roots in the Old Testament, for example, with its restrictions against murder specifically, that makes itself manifest in the Christian texts as the insistence on voluntary self-sacrifice as the foundational belief. That's a profoundly anti-violence ethos.
Do you have the belief in your theology?
Well, what do you think of that? Wait a sec. Now, redress
So
what I just said.
So I'm about to address it, but I'm
Okay.
addressing it with a question. Do you think that God is by his very essence perfect?
You'll have to provide more.
Okay, so they go on now for a very long time. You can watch the video. It's online. I think we'll post it. Hopefully we'll post it in the link below. Now, a number of points. I think it seems to me that Dr. Peterson was not so comfortable with that. And the angle he was kind of taking is you need to see the Bible in its broad context. He himself struggles with the blood-soaked past of human history, which the Bible's within and a part of, and something along those lines. Now, I think the mismatch actually is, my understanding is that the way Jordan Peterson looks at the Bible is what's it telling us to do for the future, and since this is clearly not an instruction to be done ever again, it's one-off, so it's something he leaves to wrestle with in the struggles of the past. Also, he was alluding to a view that the biblical ideas that start as ideals in the Old Testament get to bigger fruition in the New Testament. You might have seen me do a video on this in the past also. I think we'll link it in the link below, of Dinesh D'Souza having this kind of argument against Alex O'Connor, and I did a reaction to that on this topic of Amalek, so you can look up that as well. And of course, this student Ian, again, I keep calling him a student, this guy Ian is an atheist. Maybe he's a student, maybe he's a young working person. He seems quite young, but very smart, intelligent guy. pushes back and says, okay, fine, but at the end of the day, you want to tell me Christian ethics are so fantastic or biblical ethics are so fantastic. They've got this God commanding this genocide. And now his understanding, interestingly enough, is there can be no justification for this war because the only reason for this war is they came and attacked the Israelites when they came out of Egypt 400 years earlier and tried to attack them, lost the battle, and now God's saying, now I want their great-great-grandchildren wiped out. Now, I'll show you where he gets that from in the text, and I'm going to show you that he's mistaken. And then I want to really spend a few minutes dealing with this question, because it is a big question. It comes up quite often. So let's first look at where Ian's getting this from. So in the beginning of what we call Shmuel Aleph, or 1 Samuel chapter 15, in verse 1 it says that the prophet Samuel comes to King Saul and says, I've been sent by God, and this is what God says, right? Verse 2. I'm going to now, I've remembered, or I'm going to punish, or whatever it is, that which Amalek did to Israel, that they attacked him on the way out of Egypt, and now go and smite Amalek. So this is where Ian's coming from. He's saying, look, they're literally being punished now for what they did hundreds of years earlier. This is hundreds of years later. And then it literally says, don't have mercy, knock out man and woman, children, animals, everything. And in fact, in the story, what happens, they go to war, and afterwards King Saul leaves alive Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and Samuel comes and tells him it's such a terrible thing he did, and personally kills him, and the implication is therefore every single Amalekite has now been killed, and that's how it's normally understood. Now, this is actually missing an enormous amount of what's going on in the story. So I want to spend a few minutes just going through the story of Amalek in general, who they were, why God's asking them to be killed. Second of all, what is God actually commanding versus what he's not commanding? And third of all, what might the justification be? Well, they're going to be all interlinked. But let's start with the story of Amalek.
Okay, but before we get into it, I think it's important to state that none of this stuff actually happened. All these accounts of conquest and genocide are probably just fiction. The Amalekites never actually attacked Moses and the Israelites as they were leaving Egypt. This is a literary fiction, and it's a stretch to imagine Amalek would have attacked the Israelites at Rephidim, which is way far south of Amalekite territory, according to the narrative. I mean, Amalek itself is probably a literary creation. The conquest of Canaan is a literary creation, and the character of Yahweh is a literary creation as well. So the question is not what actually happened and what did God actually command. Nothing actually happened, and God didn't command anything either. The question is, what kind of morality does the Bible teach, and what moral standards does the Bible impute to God? Can the Bible be held up as a source book of morality, and can Yahweh be held up as the perfect moral being? I think that's what we're discussing here. Go on.
So yes, the very first episode we have with Amalek is in the book of Exodus, Shemos chapter 17, where the Israelites have come out of Egypt, and they're traveling through the Sinai desert, and seemingly with no provocation whatsoever, we read about how Amalek just came and attacked them. The verse just says, Amalek came, battled against Israel in a place called Rephidim. Moses is told by God to go up to send Joshua into battle, and he himself has to go up to the mountain close to God, and they defeat Amalek, and then God says there's going to be in every generation a battle between Amalek against me.
Well, that's a confusing verse. The end, God will be at war with Amalek through the ages, seems clear enough, but the first part, Kiyad al-Kesiyah, is not. According to Ibn Ezra and Ramban and many others, this phrase indicates some type of oath, and has nothing to do with anything Amalek is doing or not doing. There are a number of other possibilities which are probably more likely than the translation you're giving. And there's no textual evidence that Amalek was challenging God's sovereignty or offering any kind of theological rebellion that was any more egregious than any other nation that the Israelites engaged. So your translation seems like a stretch. By the way, the Bible is quite clear about how and when God feels dissed, because pretty much the entire Bible is the story of Israel dissing Yahweh. If the Bible wanted to convey some unique theological challenge to Yahweh posed by Amalek, it certainly has the language to do so, the same language it uses dozens of times regarding Israelite insubordination. But it doesn't. So there's nothing really special about Amalek mentioned in the Bible other than that they attacked the Israelites unprovoked and targeted their weakest members, according to Deuteronomy.
So Amalek is not just trying to destroy Israel. Amalek's, if you like, perfect original anti-Semitism, desire to annihilate the nation of Israel, is actually a war against God, interestingly enough.
No, there's very little indication of that.
And that's repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 19, that says you should wipe out, now the Hebrew word is Zecher Amalek, which is usually translated into English as the memory of Amalek. Very strange thing to do. How do you wipe up the memory of Amalek? Especially because the Torah says never forget what they did to you. And so there's different commentaries. Some say it means there will come a time when you actually have to wipe them out in the war referred to in Samuel. But Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, one of the great commentaries of 2 centuries ago, the 19th century, actually proves from there that it means wipe out the ideology or kingdom of Amalek, not necessarily to wipe out every individual. In other words, God says there's this horrific ideology in the world of killing all the Jews, trying to get rid of God.
None of that is in the biblical text. So wait a minute. Who's not being true to the biblical text here, Rabbi?
And so often we see this online, the confidence with which somebody will attack a biblical idea or Talmudic idea or a Jewish idea or whatever it is often wildly out of proportion to what the text itself says. That's putting it quite nicely.
So far, I don't observe that the kid in the video misread anything, but you're certainly doing some storytelling right now.
And you're going to have to remove that ideology from the world. But it doesn't end there. It carries on in the book of Judges, for example. They become this mortal enemy of Israel. It's not they did something once and never again. They are in every generation trying to annihilate the Israelites, massacre them wherever they can.
Give me an example. I mean, they are fighting the Israelites because the Israelites invaded their land. Isn't that right? If you believe the account in the book of Joshua, the Israelites had already genocided a dozen Canaanite towns by the time they meet the Amalekites again in the book of Judges. So what is your evidence that the Amalekites were uniquely devoted to theological battles against Yahweh or to annihilating the Israelites?
So, for example, in Judges 3 verse 13, we read that the Ammonites are at war against Israel. Guess who comes to join them, take advantage of the situation and massacre Jews? The Amalekites.
What verse indicates that Amalek sought to massacre the Jews? None. In fact, the pattern in Judges is that it is always God who subjects the Israelites to domination by other peoples. The end of chapter 2 says that God left these nations in Canaan in order to test the Jews. This is part of God's plan, according to the text. In 3:7, the Israelites screw up, so in verse 8, God lets them be dominated by Aram Naharaim. In verse 12, the Israelites screw up again, so God lets them be dominated by Moab, who allies with the Ammonites and Amalekites, and so on and so on. This is a repeating theme of Judges. The narrative makes it clear that this was all part of God's punishment for Israel's insubordination. There's no indication that Amalek was any more belligerent than the Moabites or the Ammonites or any other people. The only nation that is held morally at fault in any of this is Israel. The only nation that is castigated for trying to get rid of God is Israel, certainly not Amalek. Again, you seem to be creating stories that are not present in the actual text, the very thing you accuse Bible critics of doing.
In Judges chapter 6, you see the same thing this time. The Midianites are coming to, once again, the Amalekites.
And here again, it is God who gives the Israelites into the hands of the Midianites for Israel's bad behavior. And here it's the Amalekites and Kedemites who are allied. But it does not say that the Amalekites killed any Israelites, it just says they would come and graze their land. This hardly sounds like some kind of senseless bloodlust, let alone theological insurrection. Maybe you could accuse them of being opportunists, but that's about it. Once the war starts, the Amalekites and Kedemites are not mentioned again in the narrative. Chances are that these nations were inserted into a narrative that was initially about Midian alone, but it doesn't matter. There's nothing to indicate that Amalek was anything more than a competitor for grazing rights, not a military or theological threat. And again, in the episode in Samuel that the kid is presenting, the rationale for massacring Amalek has nothing to do with anything that happened in the book of Judges, and seems to be completely unaware of that, probably because those things never happened and were not known to the author. Like the kid said, the only rationale given for the genocide is that event that occurred when the Israelites were leaving Egypt hundreds of years earlier. So, I don't know. So far, I don't see what the kid got wrong or took out of context, but I do see you stretching the biblical verses quite a lot. Why are you doing that?
And it's perpetually like this.
Perpetually? What other mentions of Amalek are there prior to 1 Samuel? That's all of them, right? Just those two instances.
Every time there's a weakness, every time there's a vulnerability, they are there. Every time an enemy attacks, they are there.
Well, no, it's just those three, right? The initial attack in Exodus, the alliance with Moab in Judges 3, and a brief cameo appearance with Midian in Judges 6. Don't make it sound like you have dozens of other examples you could share. You don't. That's it.
They are perpetually slaughtering Israelites.
Only two of the three accounts suggest that the Amalekites were involved in actual battle with the Israelites.
And killing them. And this goes on for hundreds of years.
No, there are only the 3 episodes. Do you have a different Bible? You're just making things up, aren't you?
During which time Israel has presumably tried everything from diplomacy to military defense, and nothing is working.
Would you care to cite any verses, or is this all just your active imagination? Prior to the genocide of 1 Samuel, there are just 3 incidents with Amalek, and the third does not describe any military engagement, just territorial infraction. And again, the narrative of the genocide doesn't seem to know about any history of Amalek other than that first incident in Exodus. So I find it kind of shockingly hypocritical that you would start your video by calling out the way critics of the Bible attack a position with confidence that is out of proportion to what the text says.
And so often we see this online, the confidence with which somebody will attack a biblical idea or a Talmudic idea or a Jewish idea or whatever it is often wildly out of proportion to what the text itself says. That's putting it quite nicely.
So far, what the kid said seems entirely consistent with the biblical text, and your defense is wildly out of proportion with what the text says. You are making up an entire story of how Amalek attacked Israel and God's sovereignty over hundreds of years, a story that is nowhere visible in the biblical text. All we have in the text are the original attack of Exodus, one case in Judges where Amalek attacks together with Moab, as ordained by God, by the way, and a second case where Amalek is a competitor for grazing rights. That's what's in the text. Everything else you've said is a complete invention of your own mind. So who is disrespecting the text here?
Generation after generation, they are slaughtering and slaughtering Israelites.
You are making that up. That is not in the text. So I think you should be ashamed of yourself for doing that. It's one thing if you want to give your audience a nice homily or Torah thought and go a little bit beyond the text, but if you're making a video where your whole purpose is to set the record straight about what the text actually says, then I think you really owe it to your audience to stick to what the text actually says. And so far, from what I've seen, it's the atheist in the video who's sticking to the text, and it's you who are wildly concocting stories. That's pretty shameful and just gives a bad impression of Orthodox Jewish scholarship in general. It says you don't care as much about the text as the atheist does.
And now it all comes to the fore. So when God sends Samuel to King Saul and says, I remember what they did when they came out of Egypt, he's not saying this happened once 400 years ago and that's it.
Yes, that's exactly what the text is saying. The text gives exactly one rationale. Anything else is your own imagination.
This has been continuous since then, 4 centuries of slaughtering Israelites.
No, the text does not say that. Maybe you'd like to believe that in order to find more justification for the genocide, but that's not in the text. The text only says this is a reprisal for what Amalek did hundreds of years earlier. That's it. I mean, so is it going to come down to that you're castigating this kid for reading what the text actually says? How dare he read the text?
And now we're going to finally come up with a new strategy. Now, those familiar with Jewish legal sources and so on will be familiar. There's a mitzvah, there's a fulfillment of a biblical command to go to war against Amalek.
Well, who cares? The kid is just reading what the Bible says.
And to actually do what was done in the book of Samuel. However, let's be very, very clear. There is no biblical command to ever have a war, and that's it. The biblical command is always to follow what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 10, which is that when you go to a city to fight, and by the way, I'll come to this in a minute, but biblical wars are always against the city, not against the wider population.
The city is where the people live, but are we getting off track? Why don't you just stay with the genocide in Samuel that the video is discussing?
I'll explain why that is soon. But when you go to a city to fight, you have to always call out in peace. You have to try and negotiate a peace with them.
No, the cities of Canaan are not to be offered peace. They are to be completely destroyed. Deuteronomy 7 makes that very clear.
And the peace does not mean they have to all become Israelites. It means they have to agree to stop slaughtering Israelites. It means they have to agree to some very basic tenets that we call the Noahide law. In the ancient world, that was quite hard because people killed their own children. That violates the Noahide law of you shall not murder. There was often unjust systems of unequally applied law. That violates the Noahide law. But so these basic, what we call basic ethical monotheism, a few fundamental ethical principles, they're willing to live under them. They're willing to stop trying to kill you and attack you. That would have been it.
This is all a distraction. The Bible indicates that the people of Canaan are not to be offered peace and are to be exterminated. And that campaign of genocide is what is described in the book of Joshua. But again, why don't we stay on topic? The genocide of the Amalekites.
And Maimonides writes this explicitly in the 6th chapter of the Laws of Kings and Wars. This applies for Amalek. This applies for all the wars that the Torah talks about. You first have to try to negotiate peace.
Okay, but no one in this debate is interested in what Maimonides has to say 2,500 years after the Bible was supposedly written. The question they are debating is, what does the Bible say? And is it moral? Maimonides interpreted things to suit his own moral and philosophical views, as I'm sure you do. But the question is, what does the Bible itself say? The atheist is reading the Bible as it is, and you are coming up with excuses to read something other than what the Bible actually says. So, who is the one being honest here?
So people ask, well, how do you then destroy Amalek? That's the answer. If you can destroy them ideologically by allowing them to say we're going to stop trying to slaughter you, we're going to end our war against God and our constant attempt to annihilate the Jewish people, at that moment Amalek is gone. The ideology of Amalek is over.
You are making this all up. The text of the Bible says none of this at all. Look at the verse. Thus said God of hosts, I am exacting the penalty for what Amalek did to Israel for the assault he made upon them on the road on their way up from Egypt. Now go attack Amalek and proscribe all that belongs to him. Spare no one, but kill alike men and women, infants and sucklings, oxen and sheep, camels and donkeys. That's what the Bible says. Everything else you are making up. So again, who is reading the Bible honestly? It's the atheist, isn't it? Not the Orthodox rabbi. And, isn't that just shameful?
That's all you need to do. You don't have to do it in battle. In fact, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, perhaps the greatest halachic authority of the mid to late 20th century, wrote in an important legal analysis.
I don't care. This is distraction and diversion. What does the atheist have wrong about this passage in 1 Samuel?
That there's only one time they were ever instructed to actually go to war. Why? Isn't that biblical command to end Amalek? And he says no, the actual command to go to war has to be instructed directly from God himself. So how do you wipe out Amalek? Presumably, like Maimonides says, you try and do it through ideology, through persuasion, through other means, and once they get told to go to war. Okay, so now let's analyze the war itself.
Well, great. What does the atheist have wrong about this passage in 1 Samuel? How is he misrepresenting the text?
Right? Ian characterized it the way, to be fair to him, the most natural reading of the text is it's a war to wipe out every man, woman, or child in the whole of Amalek. That sounds like a genocide.
Right, he's reading the text.
Now, you could ask an interesting moral question. Could God himself, creator of the universe, instruct something that to us is the most morally repugnant thing? Maybe morally and spiritually you could answer yes. God is the creator of the universe. He thinks everybody into existence. He's the one who gives us our moral instincts in the first place. God may see something we don't see and instruct us to do something that feels morally horrific or repugnant to us. Theologically, you could probably say yes to that.
Theologically, that has terrible consequences because then you have no way of knowing whether God is good or evil, and the entire notion of morality is vanquished. The only thing you have left at that point is to say, I'm just following orders.
However, as we're going to see, that's not what's actually going on in this story. Of course, you'd have to be extremely sure that this is really God talking to you and not you just having dreams or hallucinations. But as we're going to see, that's a theoretical question, a very important one, but not one that's going on in this story. How do we know? Because if that was the instruction, remember the story. King Saul fails, but he only fails to kill one person, King Agag. Samuel comes the next day and kills Agag. There's a tradition that during the night, Agag found a woman, maybe in prison with him or whatever, and impregnated her, and so the seed carried on. But that would mean that at that moment in time, there was nobody left alive in the whole of Amalek.
So what does the atheist have wrong about the verses? God commands a genocide. You agree or disagree, and why is this taking so long?
Well, if all you had was Samuel chapter 15, you might think so. But if you actually read the Bible a few chapters later, chapter 27 and chapter 30, you will see there are an enormous amount of Amalekites, enough to keep raiding and destroying cities. The town of Ziklag is destroyed. David, who will become king of Israel, is fighting against them.
Right. The same thing with the Midianites, who were supposedly destroyed hundreds of years earlier in the book of Numbers, and the same is true of the Canaanite conquest in general, where Joshua is said to utterly annihilate Canaanite peoples, only to later find those same people living as neighbors and even as spouses to the Israelites. So this is a great reason to regard all of these episodes as fiction. As I said at the beginning, these narratives were created hundreds of years after the fact to explain relations between Judah and her neighbors prevailing at that time, and as polemics against certain legendary figures such as Saul. And your atheist certainly doesn't believe that any of this was written contemporaneously with the events, or is actually historical. But that's irrelevant. The question is, what moral values does the Bible teach, and do those moral values include the acceptability of killing women and children and exterminating an entire race? And according to the text, this is not only morally acceptable, but in fact demanded by God. So, where do you see the atheist misreading the text?
Battling against them. And it's only a few years, only as little as 2 years later. So quite clearly, our naive, simple reading is wrong. This was not a war that destroyed all of Amalek.
Is the naive reading of Joshua's conquest of Canaan also wrong? Do you think that actually happened? But like I said, the atheist doesn't actually believe any of this ever happened. He doesn't believe that the Israelites massacred Amalek. He thinks that this is all fiction, and the question is, what kind of moral standards are represented by the biblical text? So you're not going to catch the atheist by telling him that the genocide never actually happened. He knows it didn't happen. And he knows the conquest of Canaan didn't happen either. The question is whether the Bible can be regarded as a moral instruction.
So what is it? If you look at the classical biblical commentaries that we use, there's very little discussion of this. I'm going to give you something which is somewhat speculative in that I haven't seen a source for it inside, but I think it rigidly works with the text and is the best explanation for what we're seeing over here.
Well, the best explanation is that it's fiction, but again, that's besides the point.
And that is that in the ancient world, there is always an ambiguity as to whether we're talking about a city or a civilization. Let me explain. Civilizations in the ancient world were as follows. The majority of people lived in the hinterlands, in the wider areas, and the city controlled that area.
I suppose that's fair. There were only a few genuine cities. Most everything else was villages.
When that city became imperial and conquered other cities, the whole empire could be named for that city. So you have an Assyrian empire based around the city Assyria, Babylonian empire around the city Babylon, the Roman empire around the city Rome, and so on. So if someone were to say we're going to war to destroy Assyria, they might mean the whole of the Assyrian empire, or they might mean the central city. It's always a little bit ambiguous, and that's true of the war against Amalek too. Is it to destroy everybody in Amalek, or is it to destroy everyone in the city?
The Bible never unambiguously identifies a city called Amalek. The text states that Saul approached Amalek, which probably means the Amalekite city. This is the only time this phrase is ever used, so we can probably think of it as the largest of the Amalekite settlements. Generally, the Bible seems to imagine the Amalekites as some kind of nomadic tribe, which would not have had a permanent installation like a city.
Okay, but that still sounds pretty horrible, right? Well, let's think, how big were cities?
It doesn't matter. The Bible does not know about any city called Amalek.
Cities like Rome were gigantic. Babylon and Assyria were enormous. But Amalek, which was essentially a nomadic population, had tiny cities, more like what we would call today a citadel.
A citadel? Well, if they actually existed, they probably would have had villages.
How do we know? We found it archaeologically. We found the one or two candidate places that could be the city of Amalek.
No, we didn't. Are you making that up too?
One is called Tel Massos. It's about 15 kilometers north of Beersheba, both ancient Beersheba and the modern town as well. And it's one of two main candidate places for what would be called Amalek, literally translated city of Amalek, but really citadel.
Really, Amalekite city. That is the main Amalekite settlement.
It's got about 10 buildings of about 4 rooms each. So there's about 40 rooms in this whole city.
Well, that's lovely, but why do you think it's Amalekite?
Essentially, if this was the central urban point of Amalek, it would have been a royal residence with a few royal families, some servants, maybe one or two senior administrators like a high priest or something like that, a tiny number of people.
Okay, we don't even know that Amalek existed outside of someone's imagination, but go on. What's your point?
The other prime candidate is called Tel Ed Kudeirat, is literally about 75 or 70 meters by 40 meters. Again, we'd be talking really about a royal citadel. So this war to destroy Amalek is ambiguous. Is it to destroy everybody in the entire population, as Ian said, a genocide?
Well, that would certainly seem to be God's command. Again, here it is. Thus said God of hosts, I am exacting the penalty for what Amalek did to Israel for the assault he made upon them on the road on their way up from Egypt. Now go, attack Amalek, and prescribe all that belongs to him. Spare no one, but kill alike men and women, infants and sucklings, oxen and sheep, camels and donkeys. And look back at Exodus 17. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. God will be at war with Amalek through the ages. That is not talking about a single village of 40 rooms or whatever. That is talking about an entire people. And in fact, the term Amalek in the Bible always refers to a nation or to the original individual. It's never a place name. So yeah, if you want to actually read what the Bible says, God is commanding the extermination of the people of Amalek. The only other way to read it is to misread it.
Or is God saying, no, destroy the royal citadel?
No, there's no indication that God is saying destroy the royal citadel. You are making that up. So again, who's being more true to the text? I'd say it's the atheist by far. He's not making anything up. He's just reading what the Bible says, and you are the one concocting stories.
Well, let's take a look inside the text. In verse 5, King Saul comes. It says, King Saul came to the citadel of Amalek.
Or more correctly, Amalekite city.
And camped in the valley. Now, obviously, if you're going to attack the citadel, it's like going into the beehive. The entire military is going to come and defend it, and it's going to be a very big war. But that's only going to be a war against soldiers who afterwards are going to flee if they get defeated and go home.
What are you doing now? Are you making up a story? Why don't you just tell me what you think the atheist got wrong?
The actual commandment to kill man, woman, and child is referring apparently to the royal family based in Ir Amalek, the citadel of Amalek.
No, I'm sorry. That's complete bullshit. I read you the verses from both Exodus and Samuel. Here's the verse from Deuteronomy 25. Therefore, when the eternal your God grants you safety from all your enemies around you in the land that the eternal your God is giving you as a hereditary portion, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. In none of these sources is the command restricted to the royal family or to a particular place. And the verse in Deuteronomy indicates that this campaign against the Amalekites should take place in a time of peace. It's to be a war of aggression by Israel. All the sources implicate the Amalekite nation as a whole, and the command in 1 Samuel is to wipe it out. You're entitled to make up whatever you want, but don't tell your viewers this is what the verses say. Again, your atheist is reading the Bible as it is, and you are the one concocting fictions. You can concoct whatever you want, I don't care, but just be honest about who's being true to the text and who is not.
Why? To fulfill the biblical command of destroying the ideology of Amalek.
There is no command to destroy the ideology of Amalek. You're making that up. The command is to destroy Amalek.
But what justifies that? Why not just go after the king? So once again, let's remember, they've been going at this for 400 years. They've
Only in your imagination.
probably tried that before and it hasn't worked.
In your imagination.
You see, in the ancient world, people weren't as individual as today, right? People's consciousness was much more the tribe they're in, and their identity was tied to the local tribal family, the chieftain family. If that family is still alive, the ideology will sustain itself, and in this case, it's the sickest ideology. Amalek is an ideology of constantly trying to massacre and murder Israelites and get rid of God in the world.
Only in your imagination. There's no text to support that Amalek is constantly trying to massacre Israelites, and there's no text to support the Amalekites trying to get rid of God in the world. Only the Israelites are ever accused of doing such a thing. And there's no indication that Amalek had any ideology at all, other than perhaps an ideology of cowardice and opportunism for attacking the weak of the Israelites as portrayed in Deuteronomy. And by the way, don't forget that Amalek was seemingly one of the native Canaanite peoples. The Israelites were the invaders, according to biblical mythology. The account in Judges 6 paints a picture of how miserable it was for the Israelites when the Amalekites moved into their grazing territory. Would you imagine that it was any less miserable for the Amalekites when the Israelites took their land away from them? I mean, if you're trying to paint a picture of geopolitical context, the context the Bible gives us is not that Amalek was constantly harassing the Israelites, it's that the Israelites invaded Canaanite land in a wave of genocidal conquest. So again, let's just be honest about what the Bible says.
So that's who they are. How do you end that? They've tried everything for hundreds of years. They've tried defending themselves. They've tried diplomatic measures. They've tried working with peace. They've tried nothing's worked.
Well, nothing true about what you just said. You're making all that up. None of that is written in the Bible. So again, I see the atheist being honest about what's written in the text, and I see the Orthodox rabbi confabulating and dissembling, and it's very disappointing.
And in desperation, God says, okay, I'm going to tell you what's going to work. If you eliminate the whole royal family, why?
You're inventing. Nowhere does it say such a thing.
Because so long as one child remains, the population will wait for them. That's not just, by the way, my speculation. You see that in the biblical text, precedent for this. For example, in Judges chapter 9, Gideon's children, one is called Avimelech, and he wipes out his family, but one child is hidden and survives, and he's later able to announce a revolt in which Avimelech is deposed.
What does that have to do with anything? This is just more distraction and diversion.
Chapter 11, the Queen Asalia, who assassinates the entire family. One child is hidden, Josiah, Yoshiahu.
No, Josiah was 200 years later.
And because of that, he's able later to come back and the people will work with him to overthrow her. So keeping one child alive means the ideology stays alive.
Well, I mean, that's a lovely justification for genocide, but why don't we just deal with the verses? God commands wiping out Amalek, the entire people. It doesn't say what the rationale is other than just vengeance. If you want to imagine that God is trying to stamp out some imaginary ideology, that's fine, but that's not supported by the text. But even if it was, it would still be genocide. So, I mean, do I need to remind you that the atheist's argument is that the Bible is not a moral guidebook? So, in your view, is it moral to kill every last child in order to exterminate an ideology? Why don't you just argue the morality of that if you think that's an example of moral behavior?
And so without a divine commandment, we could not do this.
Well, that's not the question. The question is whether the divine commandment is moral, and so far all you've done is obfuscate.
But after centuries of effort, God intervenes and says, really sorry, I'm telling you this is the right thing to do, even if it feels morally problematic to you.
God does not say any of that according to the narrative. You are making stuff up and not addressing at all whether it is morally problematic to kill children for something their distant ancestors did. Again, the atheist is addressing the text, and you are creating a fantasy to cover up the text. I think it's embarrassing. Why is the atheist the one who is respecting the biblical text?
Is to completely destroy everything associated with the citadel, including its livestock, everything, so that the people will then be able to move on ideologically, and you will destroy the ideology of Amalek for once and for all.
What does killing the donkeys have to do with destroying anyone's ideology? Are the donkeys going to teach the next generation of donkeys this supposedly toxic ideology? So the donkeys are a threat to transmit toxic ideology, but the Amalekites who live next door to the city are not a concern? And where does it say anything about such a toxic ideology anyway? It doesn't. The only people who are accused of having a toxic ideology, and they are accused of this again and again and again and again, are the Israelites. So if anyone was deserving on account of toxic ideology to be exterminated, man, woman, and child, it would have been the Israelites, right? Okay, let's leave behind your fantasies and return to the verses. God commands wiping out the Amalekites. There's no mention of any particular ideology or any pattern of harassment. The only reason the Bible gives for the genocide is exactly as the atheist said, something that happened 400 years earlier. You just indicated that you find this morally problematical, so spit it out. Is it moral to exterminate women and children for crimes they did not commit? Because that appears to be God's wish and command. Do you believe that genocide is a moral good or a moral evil? The Bible seems to think it's a moral good.
Saul waged the war, and he kept alive one man, the king Agag.
In the story, we're not really interested in the story. It's fiction.
The next day Samuel came and killed him, but the seed of Amalek was alive. So was an enormous amount of the population.
Not in that account. It says Saul destroyed Amalek all the way from Havilah to Shur, not just a single place. This probably means their entire territory, and it says he proscribed all the people, kol ha'am. In this account, it is indeed a genocide, but again, none of this really happened in all likelihood, and what we need to focus on is the Bible's endorsement of genocide. We're not putting anyone on trial for an actual genocide that actually happened. That's not the question. We're inquiring about the moral characteristics of the Bible and whether it can be considered a moral guidebook or a moral standard. Is the God who commands killing children for something their great-great-great-great-great-grandparents did the kind of being who we should take moral instruction from? Would you send your kids to Yahweh's school of morality? I certainly wouldn't.
Because there had not been a command, apparently, to wipe out all the men, women, and children of the whole population.
Well, the command is right there in black and white. In the Bible, God commands many things that are not executed faithfully. How about this command? Do you believe the fact that the Israelites spend the next 900 years worshiping every god besides Yahweh to be an indication that this command does not mean what it says? I don't think so. But like I said before, the stories are all fiction. What we want to know is what is the moral sense of the Bible, and it's pretty clear that what God is asking for is indeed genocide. The moral sense of the Bible is that genocide is justified because of some ancient grievance. It's pretty plain. None of the other ideas that you suggested, such as that it's only the royal family or that there's some uniquely toxic ideology, are even remotely attested by the text. So again, the atheist is honoring the text and you are not.
This was not apparently a command of genocide. It was apparently a command to destroy the citadel and the royal family so that the rest of the population that survived would no longer be Amalek, but become something else.
That is a complete fairy tale that you just made up out of thin air. Again, the text is clear. The text says, kill them all. So you say all doesn't mean all. That just means a few. The text says, kill them because of what their ancestors did 400 years ago. You say, well, that doesn't mean what their ancestors did 400 years ago. It means because of their toxic ideology. You just don't want to deal with the text, so you're making things up. But the atheist is just reading what the Bible says. And this is not the only time the Bible endorses genocide, by the way. Joshua's campaign of conquest is one genocide after another. Moses commands killing all the male Midianite children and non-virgin women at the end of Numbers. The plain reading is that the Bible endorses genocide,
thereby fulfilling the biblical instruction of getting rid of that ideology from the world.
There's no such biblical instruction. You're completely fantasizing that.
Now, that may still raise moral questions, but it's a completely different question to the one that Ian was pushing against Jordan Peterson.
Why is it a completely different question? Is killing children on account of ideology a higher moral level than killing children on account of ancient grievances?
Now, I don't blame Jordan Peterson for not being so familiar with a lot of the things I was saying.
Because the things you were saying, you were making up as you went along. So of course neither Jordan Peterson nor the atheist is going to be familiar with your personal fantasies. They only know what's written in the text of the Bible, which is really the only thing under discussion here.
But he is correct when you look at the whole thing in context of who Amalek is all the way through.
How about in the context of the Israelites invading Canaan and displacing indigenous people because their God told them they could? Is that not an interesting context? Is that an example of biblical morality? I can steal your stuff because my God said so? But really, the only context the narrative in Samuel is interested in is the context of Amalek's attack in Exodus. So the atheist is exactly right on this point. You are confabulating a story to avoid taking the Bible at its word, and the atheist is taking the Bible at its word. If your recommendation for how to read the Bible as a moral teaching is to not read what the Bible actually says, that is a pretty damning commentary on the Bible's moral status, don't you think? That puts you on the atheist's side in this debate, don't you think? The atheist is saying, don't read the Bible for morality, and you're saying, don't read the Bible for morality.
In context of how the ancient world operated, in context of exactly what is said, and in context of the fact that Amalek is clearly left alive.
And not in the narrative we're discussing. Remember, none of this actually happened. The question we're studying is what the moral message of the Bible is.
And not killed, and nobody criticizes King Saul for leaving the masses of Amalek alive.
Because he doesn't in that narrative. It says he kills them all except Agag. Again, it's plain in the text that you are choosing not to honor.
When you put it all into context that way, especially in the context of Deuteronomy and the obligation to call out in law, the context of how Maimonides codifies the law.
Yes, we know the rabbis changed everything over hundreds of years. Jordan Peterson and the Atheist don't care. The question is whether the Bible is a moral book, not whether Maimonides transformed it into a moral book.
The context of the teachings that I quoted, then it does become an extremely different question.
No, the original question remains. If you read the text, God commands genocide. If you make up fantasies, then maybe it doesn't. Again, if in order to make the Bible into a moral book, you have to avoid reading what the Bible says, then I think you've confirmed that the Bible is not a moral book. And you've confirmed the atheist's point.
A rabbi I really respect once said, if you feel there's a struggle between biblical ethics, God's divine command, and our own inner sense of morality, usually it's because we either didn't understand the biblical story correctly, or we didn't understand ethics correctly and have to investigate whether our moral intuitions really are as accurate as we think they are, or very often we just didn't understand both.
Sure, that's possible, but I think the biblical narrative is really clear. Kill them all. It says that several times. I don't see how you read that other than kill them all. And at least my moral intuition is pretty clear that killing children for crimes that someone else committed long ago is a moral transgression. I assume you feel the same way. So yeah, I think there is a genuine conflict here, and that's why we can't regard the Bible as a source book for moral guidance.
So whilst we are absolutely committed to whatever it is the creator of the universe says, that's the ultimate authority, in this particular case, a study of all the biblical context suggests that the command is to destroy the ideology. In one moment of time, it became a command to wipe out the entire royal family, only after 4 centuries of doing everything else possible.
And like I said, there's nothing to support that story at all. At all. You're making up a complete fiction, and if you need to create a fantasy to show that the Bible is moral, I think you've proved the atheist's point. The Bible is not moral.
The command was not adhered to, the seed of Amalek remained in the world, and centuries later, in the later biblical text, they're still trying to annihilate and destroy the entire nation of Israel.
Right, which is why the Bible cannot be trusted as history. But that's besides the point. What we want to know is, did God command genocide in the narrative? And the text is plain. If you find it necessary to read the text as completely contrary to what it says, then not only can the Bible not be a source book for morality, it can't be used reliably for anything.
So I don't expect that either Ian or Jordan Peterson would necessarily be so aware of either of those things that I've just shared with you right over here.
No, the atheist at least feels some obligation to the text of the Bible, and you don't, or so it appears. Keep in mind, the atheist doesn't believe any of this stuff in the Bible, but he's trying to play by your rules, that this is a sacred text written by God that adherents are supposed to believe and follow. If you were sitting in Peterson's seat, you would really owe it to the atheist to say, oh, by the way, I don't really believe what it says in the Bible either. I just like to make up my own stories. Because then Ian, the atheist, could say, oh, okay, that's fine, but I wanted to discuss the morality of the Bible, so can you please get me someone who does believe the text of the Bible?
But I do think Jordan Peterson is correct about this point, that you do need to look at the biblical story in its broader context to understand exactly what's going on. Either way, Sancherib came along, destroyed all the nations around, and there's not been an actual nation called Amalek in the world for many, many centuries.
There's no evidence there ever was one at all. It's probably fiction or gross exaggeration of something known to authors around the Babylonian exile.
However, in the Kabbalistic text, the Kedushas Levi, for example, and the Hasidic works, talk about how Amalek is a certain evil that exists all over the world. Sometimes it will manifest in a culture that comes to kill you, and you have to defend yourself and be willing to defend yourself against them. Often it manifests in it as an inner evil too, and our war to destroy Amalek is often an internal war to destroy our own inner evil within us.
Well, that's lovely, but it has nothing to do with the genocide prescribed in the Bible.
Thereby lighting up the whole world. As for Peterson's broader point that the biblical ethics are the ethics that have changed civilization and humanity, I have videos on that topic too. It is correct. And his broader point, I believe, is 100% right. The biblical text transformed civilization, radically changed the value system of mankind.
That's a sweeping claim. How so?
In everything from the glorification of peace instead of war, justice instead of hierarchy, and many other items. education of every child, social responsibility, the infinite value of every life, all these sorts of things which I speak about in other videos.
All of those things are highly debatable. God commands plenty of war in the Bible. There is plenty of hierarchy in the Bible, and the infinite value of every life is clearly not a biblical value. But whatever, you're in love with the Bible, which is great. It is an amazing work. I just wish you would read it more carefully and honor what it actually says rather than making things up. Because I gotta say that when an atheist is reading the Bible carefully and respecting the text, and the Orthodox rabbi is making up stories that subvert the text, I think that's embarrassing. And in the end, anyway, it's nothing but an admission that the atheist was right all along. The text is deeply immoral and cannot be accepted by moral people today.